Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
My next guest is James Purpura. Only 2 years removed from solitary confinement in jail, James Purpura began his journey into the tech world. In 2007, he took a chance on a small construction software startup called PlanSwift. He quickly ascended to vice president of sales, and then, just a year later, took over as president and became an equity partner in the company. Under James's leadership, PlanSwift grew from $8,000 a month in volume to over $1 million a month in volume, and over 50,000 customers in 24 countries, becoming one of the most well-known and largest technology companies in the construction industry. In 2013, James led the M&A process to sell PlanSwift to a firm outside of Chicago called Textura. Shortly after joining Textura, James helped the company go public. Over the next few years, James ran 4 different business units at Textura and played an instrumental role in facilitating a $650 million exit of Textura to Oracle. James spent 6 months working as vice president at Oracle before negotiating the purchase of his original business, PlanSwift, back from Oracle. Again, at the helm of PlanSwift, James quickly led the company to generate sufficient revenue to repay the purchasing costs, positioning PlanSwift as an attractive acquisition target. With PlanSwift firmly established, James negotiated a lucrative sale to a large competitor, allowing him to exit and pursue his dream of creating the world's first personal evolution company. Just 15 years earlier, James had hit rock bottom, beaten down by life with shattered self-esteem. His addictions had resulted in jail time. He was financially, emotionally, and spiritually bankrupt. At the lowest point of his life, he met his future wife and business partner, Steph, and together they pursued a vision of becoming more. Shortly after meeting James, Steph wrote his first resume and taught him how to send an email. Because despite the fact that James had started and sold several tech companies, he still struggled and still struggles with email. Along their journey of personal growth and self-improvement, James and Steph saw an opportunity to disrupt an industry which ironically appeared to be perpetually stuck in the dark ages, the personal development industry. As a rags-to-riches, non-formally educated, successful tech founder with a serious interest in philosophy, James recognized the uniqueness of his position to disrupt the personal development industry for the better. Together, James and Steph felt an urgency to pursue their life mission to inspire individuals to tap into their unlimited potential and push humanity forward through a personalized combination of philosophy, science, technology, and community. They agreed it was time to launch their next venture, Powerful You, the world's first personal evolution company. James and Steph and their team have published a book, produced an award-winning movie, developed a game-changing personal perception assessment, and launched the Powerful Universe, a global platform for teaching and learning personal evolution. James has built strong international partnerships and an influencer network that already reaches over 50 million followers. On stage and on camera, James is compelling, authentic, riveting, and has enriched audiences around the world. James, welcome.
Tim, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, and I really love the work that you guys are doing over at Journey's Dream.
Well, it's an honor to have you on the show. I wanted to start off with a question because you're a person who's made quite a bit of money in business and then turned the focus what makes you want to work in the mental health field?
Well, I guess, for me, it's not just about mental health. It's about, the evolution of the species, helping people wherever they're at move their lives forward. And so the answer to that question is, when we sold our technology company a couple of years ago, my wife and I had a conversation, and it was, is this, should we retire, first of all? Should we just move to Hawaii, call it quits and check out, or, what else should we do? And the question we had to ask ourselves is this the world that we want our children and grandchildren to grow up in? And the answer to that question was no. So I believe if you have the means to do something about it, you have the responsibility.
That's pretty powerful. I'm grateful for people like you reaching that conclusion.
Well, and the other thing is, I went to a mental health symposium first, and, it was this idea of a bunch of mental health professionals, and they were all sitting around talking about the suicide epidemic and all of these problems facing us as a society. And, a couple of really interesting questions got asked, but the first one was what they identified, and they very clearly stated, is that no matter what the one thing we do know is there's not enough mental health professionals to be able to address the size of this problem. And, afterwards I caught a couple of the panelists and we were having a discussion, and they said, one of them was a big donor to this facility, and they go every week and they meet with the board members over there and they ask the same question. And the same question is, what do you think, why is it increasing so quickly right now? Why are mental health crises increasing? And they never have an answer for that question, but I actually do know the answer for that question. And, there are some simple things that we can do as a society to really get in and have a profound change, or the ability to impact people on a very deep level. And in my mind, that's the whole package. You have to start with the awareness of what the problem is, how it came into fruition, what it's looking like today, and what's the solution. Because I think when you take the personal development space, so oftentimes you go to a seminar or something and they don't tell you why you should do something. They just tell you what to do. Here's what you need to do. Adopt this mindset, or do this, or do that. And the problem with that is I always want to know why something works and how something works, because unless I know why, then I won't fully understand the cost of not doing it or engaging in it. And so in my mind, if you take the whole population, right, and you think about if mental health or, ability is, 1 to 10, right, it's a lot easier to take somebody from a 5 to a 10 than it is to take somebody from a 1 to a 2 in that scenario. So what we're trying to do is to take pressure off professionals like you by giving everyday people who may not have had as much trauma as some other people the tools they need to understand what's going on and to move their lives forward.
Well, and that, as you're talking, I think having read your book and watched the movie at Powerful You, that you and your wife both had significant trauma. And so if these tools that you're presenting in the book have worked for you, then they're really going to be effective for people who've had half as intense a trauma or a little bit more nurturing lifestyle. That's So, it's interesting because one of my best friends in the world had significant trauma as well in his childhood, and he's a therapist, right? And so we have something called the emotional integration technique, which is very similar to things like CBT, and different things. But when we developed this technique, I called him and I said, I want to explain this technique to you over the phone because I want to see if you can get it just by a simple explanation. I'm not going to go into it deep. I'm just going to give you the framework and you try to apply it to your life and see if it works. Now, because of this guy's trauma, he became a therapist because he wanted to learn how to heal his own trauma. He had been through EMDR, he'd been through CBT, he'd been through every type of therapy. And when he started doing the emotional integration technique, his life jumped
his development jumped in a way that he couldn't possibly imagine, having been in the industry. And so the question is why? And here's the answer we came up with is this. So if I'm doing CBT, or if I'm doing EMDR, or any of these other, processes, generally that means I need somebody to facilitate that for me, right? And when you need somebody to facilitate it for you, you're still dependent on somebody else for your growth. And when he took off and started using the emotional integration technique, he grew more in a shorter period of time than he had ever done with those other tools. And so what it really is, whether it's in an aftercare situation, right, or it's in somebody who doesn't, quite isn't to the point where they need therapy, these tools give the ability for people to understand principles and ideas and concepts and tools that will move their lives forward and create a sense of well-being inside of them that they could never possibly imagine before.
Well, and one of the keys in your book that you talked about was having heard about how important meditation was and doing it just because you were told it was important to do and getting very limited results. And then you stepped into the big key, which was, instead of doing the mind meditation, incorporating the energies and feelings in your body. Can you tell a little bit about what that did for your growth?
I made a big statement earlier, which is I actually know what's causing the mental health crisis. And so I want to talk about that for a second because it's the answer to your question. And so essentially I had this friend call me up, and this friend, he had probably the most traumatic childhood that he had ever experienced, that I'd ever heard of at that point. And so I was talking to him, and he said, James, my life's going back to hell. I'm in my addiction. I'm drinking in my car. Things are terrible again. I know that everything's getting ready to fall apart. Can you help me? Right? And so as we were kind of talking through what he was experiencing, he asked me a question, right? And he goes, I had 5 good years. I'm like, what do you mean you had 5 good years? He goes, I had 5 years where none of the trauma from my past impacted me at all. And I had been talking to him about the autonomic nervous system and the fight or flight system and things like that. And it hit me. I knew the guy was a marathon runner, right? And I said to him, are you still running? He said, no. I said, how long has it been since you have ran? And he said, it's been 3 years. And I said, how did that 5-year period of time correlate with you running marathons? And he said, it was the exact same period of time. When I started running marathons, everything in my life shifted and changed. When I stopped, it started to digress. And so I explained to him about this idea of being fight or flight in the autonomic nervous system, and how, in fact, that breathing is the key to switching back out of fight or flight into a state of homeostasis, or rest and digest. And he said, well, that's really interesting because I used to do breath work, breathing exercises to improve my time when I was running. And so here's what we find, and going back to the answer to your question is that the challenge I think that we're facing as a species right now is that the reason that human being is the apex predator, the reason we survived was actually the development of our perception. Because we learned to project our fear into the future to get ready for an attack that wasn't there yet is what gave us an edge over the other predators. All other animals only go into fight or flight when the threat presents itself. And so human beings are the lone animals that can project fear into the future in order to move themselves into a heightened state of awareness. Now, that's the reason we survived as a species, but that's also the reason we're now dying. And that's where the mental health crisis is coming, is because even though that we're living in the safest time in known history, right? Recorded history, most people go, what? We are? They don't even realize it. Is that we feel the most unsafe. And so when we look at the suicide rates, the highest rate of suicide is girls between 10 and 14 years old. I don't know what you were doing at 10 and 14 years old, but I wasn't thinking about suicide, right? And the question is why? And there's actually hints when you look at it, and the hints are this. Let me ask you a question, Tim. How many overweight kids were there in your elementary school?
Just a few, and they stood out for that reason.
Right. There was only one in mine, only one. And I still remember her name because it was so unusual, right? And so the question is, now, I don't know about you, but I grew up in the 70s. I ate Lucky Charms for breakfast, Kool-Aid for lunch, Pop-Tarts. I mean, my diet was horrific. Wonder Bread, you can imagine. And so, but nobody was overweight, and we were all eating that way. And the question is why are kids overweight now? And that's the clue that really kind of clued us in. It's because we feel so unsafe as adults. Because the globalization of news is bringing all the bad news to our phones every second, we have adopted this feeling of being unsafe, unsecure. And we've imposed that feeling on our kids. And they're getting these phones at very young ages, and they're reading about things like school shootings. When I was a kid, there was like the nightly news, and we didn't even watch it because it was super boring, right? My parents watched it. We were outside playing. But because as a society, we're being inundated with negativity and bad news all day long.
Just the concentration of the worst from around the globe.
Constantly, second to second to second. It has caused us to be it's triggered us to be in a fight or flight system that was only made to be in periodically. And what does it do? It slows down your digestion. Your intestines don't work as good. You lose the connection with the part of your brain that can actually process this. And so essentially, here's what I discovered. And this is the long answer to your question is, that 70 or 80% of the most successful people in the world do one thing every day. Do you know what that is?
Exercise?
They meditate, right? And so the question is, what is the benefit of meditation? And here's what most people fail to realize is meditation was never about clearing your head. It was always about the breath work and what the breath actually does for you. And so here's the explanation is that when you move into fight or flight mode, you lose connection with your brain essentially, and you move into a lower state of consciousness. And so your brain does not have the ability to go in and turn that off. That has to be generated from the body. And so what is the signal that the body uses to signal that it's time to move back into homeostasis? And if you think about the fact that we're running from a predator, the first thing you have to do when you stop is you have to catch your breath. It's that deep heart-based breathing. And so when you get into deep heart-based breathing, essentially what it does is it signals your brain to reconnect, to take back control, and you move into a higher state of consciousness. And so here's what the most successful people in the world are doing unbeknownst to them, is they're literally taking control of their physiology. And so as you can imagine, it's a lot easier to go from 50% triggered to 100% triggered than it is to go from 0 to 25. So people who are doing a practice of breathing every day are essentially reversing the effects of physiology through our evolution by taking control of that, even if they're not aware of that. And so that's where the mental health crisis comes in. And that's where, for me, the meditations really took off, is as I moved my meditation in my body and started breathing deeper, what I began to understand is that, that your body is your subconscious mind. Even though memories are stored in your brain, emotions are stored in your body. And those unprocessed emotions are what's keeping you stuck and creating all this trauma that you're constantly experiencing.
Well, and you've incorporated in your book mentions of people like Peter Levine and his work with trauma, which is so powerful and gentle. That's one of the reasons I've been drawn to it over the years. And as I remember in your book, you said when you got that piece to start at figuring out what's going on in the body and releasing those energies, your work progressed exponentially. Is that correct?
It did, because what happened is that, so here's kind of the story. So, we haven't talked about my story a little bit, but I had a lot of trauma in my life, and I ended up in solitary confinement, right? And so from the time I left solitary confinement, my wife and I met shortly thereafter, and we started working really hard, like talking about perceptions and emotions and ideas and concepts. We had no idea what we were doing. But from that time, it took me from jail to my first $1 million was 9 years. When people hear that, they go, that's amazing. And I think that was the longest period of time in my life because we spent every night working. But when we reached our first $1 million, I looked at my wife and I said, are you happy? And she said, no. I said, well, me either. And, so we figured we just needed more money. So we went to 2, and it still wasn't the case. So we had to turn around and figure out what creates happiness. And so essentially what we discovered is through this process is that what it takes to create happiness and well-being are not the same things, but they are two sides of the same coin that we call perception. Creating money and things on the outside world is all about shifting your perception of the meaning after it comes out as an assumption in your mind, changing your perception of the outside world. Creating happiness is all about shifting your perception of the inside world. And so here's what we essentially figured out is that, when you have an experience, especially when you're a kid, you don't have the mental or physical capacity to defend yourself, so you stand up fear to do it, and that fear basically has an emotion attached to it, and that emotion gets repressed in your body. So essentially, here's what happens from a perception point of view is every time that you're having an experience, your mind does something similar to a Google search, right? Because you don't see reality, it's going in and it's finding situations that are similar to the situation that you're now having, and it applies that meaning. Now, here's where most people get messed up is they don't understand that meaning or the old memory it used also has an emotion tied to it because, memories that have unprocessed emotion tied to them are more readily available for your brain to access. And so it's like something happens and you have a level of emotion that doesn't seem to fit the situation. Well, what happened? It's because there's an unprocessed emotion that's trapped in your body that needs to be processed. And that's why emotions really are the indicators to what's going on inside of you, and they're stored in the body. And so what we discovered is it's kind of like, you think about it like, defragging your computer or going and, cleaning something up. So we're going into the past, to our past experiences. We're processing the old emotion. We're imprinting a new emotion of love and gratitude there. And so the next time, unbeknownst to us, that my mind grabs that memory to dictate what's going to happen next, it will come with a very different emotional response. And so people often wonder why they're on these emotional roller coasters. Everything's like, it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. It's because your body and your mind is so full of unprocessed emotions that are caught in your system that are tied to old memories that your mind is constantly accessing to predict what's going to happen next. And that's where the emotional roller coaster comes in. I think in society, and this is really interesting, it's like, I feel like we've been made to choose. Do you want money and all the things that come along with that? Or do you want, well-being? And it's like, we don't think we can have both. So essentially what we do is you choose. And, it's like, well, what does that get us? It gets us a bunch of rich people that are miserable, and it gets us a bunch of spiritual people who are broke. And that doesn't seem to be optimal to us. So what we had to do was go out and figure out what it is that creates happiness. And what we had to do was we had to clean out our past of all those unprocessed emotions so that our perception was no longer accessing those as a part of living.
Well, and I think one of the keys there is, and sometimes I run into this with people where they say, well, I can't change the past. And what you're talking about is the very powerful truth that while I may not be able to change the past in terms of what happened, I can certainly change the meaning I'm giving it. And,
absolutely.
And the interpretation that I place on it. It's one of the powerful things about the process that you have in your book is that I'm not just going to detach the negative emotions from my memories of a past event. I'm actually stepping into the space of gratitude for the learning that that event can provide.
Right. And so that's the emotion that you put into it. Not only do you have gratitude for the fear that you chose to adopt, right? But you also have the gratitude for the version of you that chose to adopt that fear, right? Because I think we spend so much time beating ourselves up. But, there's something interesting you said there, and it has to do with this idea of, I lost it.
Well, one of the quotes from the movie was, "Free will lives in the past. In order to change the future, I change the history of my past meanings. And when I do that, then when I create a meaning today, it's happening from a different foundation, a different place of the recognition, as you said, of the strengths that I had that helped me survive those difficult situations in the past, rather than beating myself up for not responding in a way that would, is more like the picture of the superhero who just blasts his or her way through something."
Right. And I think there's a really interesting thought around that. And it's this, is human beings have an operating system. And here's the core foundation of our operating system. We can only act in accordance with our beliefs based on our current physiological state. Right. And so the question is, do I have free will? And the answer is yes, but not in the way that you think that you do. Based on that statement, you're only ever acting in accordance with your beliefs. And so, we like to tell people, if your life isn't what you want it to be, it's not because you've done something wrong. It's because you made the only decision you could with the information you had available to you. And why is that exciting? Is because you've only ever been doing the best you can. Because really, it's not you. We all make decisions the same way, right? We take all the information and we make the best decision we can. And so it's not a decision, it's not a you problem, it's an information problem. And that's where people get caught up, is they're constantly beating themselves up for the decisions that they botched or made. When in fact, you did the best you could. It's an information problem. So you're wasting your time beating yourself up. And so when you think about that, human beings can only make, only act in accordance with belief based on the current physiological state. Well, what does that mean? Do you have free will? And the answer is yes and no. And here's the first thing, is in the moment, right, as you're experiencing something, you can only act according to your beliefs in your current physiology state. So you don't actually have free will in that moment because your beliefs are driving your behavior. But here's where we have free will. It's exactly what you read in the book. It's like, well, I can actually go and change my beliefs. So the next time I face that very same situation, I can respond differently because there's a different belief driving my behavior. Now, here's something that, our mutual friend Mark and I have been talking a lot about, I've been thinking a lot about recently, and it's this. And this is why I added the last part of that on, based on your current physiological state. Right. It's this. I want anybody to think about if you have ever had an addictive behavior, or if you're making a decision that you're really unsure about, right? And that decision is tied to fear. So I've been tossing around this concept of what is healing? How can we heal? And here's what the process looks like for me. So you have three components to fear. There's the perception or psychology, there's the physiology, and then there's biology. I know nothing about biology, so I'm not going to speak to that part. We're going to talk about perception and physiology. And so you have a perception of fear, and then you have the physiology of fear. When those two things are attached, you don't actually have the ability, the cognitive ability in that moment to process that perception. And if you attempt to, it will loop back because you didn't get the physiology piece. And so essentially what you have to do in order to process trauma is that you have to separate or create space between the perception of fear and the physiology of fear. If you walk down and detach or create space between the perception and the physiology, essentially, coming out of fight or flight through things like breathing, walking in nature, there's a whole host of things you can do. Then your brain takes back control. You move to a higher state of awareness, and then and only then do you have the option of actually processing the physiology or the perception of it. But you can't do it when the physiology is still attached. And so Mark and I were having a conversation the other day, and it was like, there's always a pause. And I realized this, and that's where the key is this. let's say that you're an addict, right? And what is an addict? You know, and I talk to addicts all the time because I used to be there. And it's like, well, why do you use? What do you mean, why do I use? Because I'm an addict. No, it's not actually why you use. You use because you're trying to escape something. What are you trying to escape, right? And so the things that we're trying to escape get triggered, and that's when we go into our addictive behavior. But there's always a pause, right? And so essentially what happens is that your mind goes into fear and your body joins, and then you move into the behavior of action, whether that be addiction or playing out some type of pattern in your life. But there is a pause that happens between those two things. It's like the perception comes up, the physiology comes up, and you pause. That is your moment, right? And what is that pause for? Because we don't understand that pause, right? Essentially what that pause is being created by is your mind is recognizing a contradiction between what you want and what you're getting ready to do. And the massive contradiction that's in causes you a pause. That pause is your opportunity to walk down the physiology. Now, let me be very clear. So it's like, you know, fear gets triggered, the physiology attaches, I have a pause because I'm getting ready to act in a way that's not, that's not congruent with what I want. And in that moment, I can walk down the physiology or I can go act in the behavior. I don't actually have the ability to process it then because I'm not attached to my mind. But here's what we need to understand is that the first step is awareness. Because what happens is if you recognize that process when you're thrown into fear and you recognize the pause and you recognize the fact that you're going to choose the fear, right? You're not going to breathe in that moment, but you know that you have the option to. If you can learn to recognize that, what happens is that this trigger gets attached to whatever happens next. And so as you watch your behavior unfold, whether it be addiction or anything else, what you start to realize is there was a cost to this. And when your mind starts to calculate the cost, because we learn through pain, at some point that is not going to be, the most conducive way. At some point, the pain's going to become unsustainable. You're going to be like, it's not worth it. And then and only then will you actually have the option in that pause to use the tool of breathing and walking down the physiology. And so the big key is not to beat yourself up. These patterns have been in place for a very long time. The first key is the awareness that they're playing out. And in that pause, realize that your best tool and your only tool is to start taking deep breaths. And as you start to take deep breaths, you will create that space between the perception and the physiology. And once your mind shifts into a higher state of awareness, then you're at the point that you actually have choice again, right? Because you can choose to process that thought or behavior. And if you stay in the physiology of fear, you don't have choice. And that's literally what Albert Einstein meant by you can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness that was created, because problems are, created here, right? Solving the problem has created a higher state of consciousness.
Well, and I agree wholeheartedly. The thing I talk to people about is that if I can get myself to practice that deep breath, the pause that refreshes, comfortably fill my lungs, hold for 2 or 3 seconds at the top, and then resist the exhale so it's nice and slow. I'm not doing that when the bear is chasing me. I'm doing that in my calm moments. And if I do that, it's like developing this muscle memory. And most people understand muscle memory. People can be away from riding a bicycle for 10 or 15 years, and somebody brings a bicycle along and they can get on it. The body remembers how to do that. So I coach people that if they can do what you're recommending and practice that breathing, it will build a muscle memory. Then when they get to that pause that you're talking about and they've been training themselves to recognize it, and the cost-benefit analysis comes up, you know what? I don't really want to go drink again because it costs me too much. When they stop and take that breath, then a whole cascade of changes in the body to disrupt that physiology happen. And as you talked about, the fight or flight response, one of the first things that happens when the fight or flight response happens is less blood goes to the brain.
Yeah.
That extra blood stops going to my internal organs to digest food, and all that blood's ready for my back and my legs to run or fight for my life. Well, the first thing I want to do, if it's not an actual life and death situation, is get that breathing going and restore the blood flow to the brain.
It's such an interesting thing. You asked a question yesterday, a little bit earlier, and I kind of skirted around it. I wanted to touch on it for a second, because I think it's a really important point. What you said is that people often say to you, I can't go back and change the past, right? And so I was actually sitting in my jail cell. And, shortly after getting there, I realized I wanted to change my life. So I started reading a lot of books. And I used to write these long lists of people who I felt like had harmed me. And the idea is that I would go into a prayer meditation, I would offer them forgiveness. But my current understanding of forgiveness was the one I learned as a child, and it didn't really resonate with me. And so one day I was looking at this long list of people who had harmed me, and I had this epiphany. Here was what it was. I looked down and thought, the only common denominator between all of those situations is me. What if I'm somehow the creator of all of this? Well, I'd never to that point, because I'd lived a pretty terrible life, never considered the fact that I might be the creator of my experiences. And so I thought about what it meant on both sides of that coin. I thought, well, if I'm not the creator of my experience, what does that mean? Well, it means the world, because I had a pretty bad life, it means the world really is a terrible place, and I probably don't want to play anymore. But if I was, in fact, the creator of my experiences, what did that mean for me? And here's where I got to, is that it meant that I would have to take responsibility for all the things that had happened to me. But it also meant that if I could figure out the mechanism by which I created those experiences, then I could create something new and magical in its place. And that's where my journey started off, with a question, because I needed to figure out, I chose on that day to take responsibility for everything that ever happened to me. And that was the ownership piece. And then I decided that I was going to figure out, what it was, how we created our lives. So the next question I asked myself was, because I had some traumatic situations in my childhood, I thought to myself, does my trauma define me? Right? And so I really looked at that, and I was like, well, if my trauma defines me, that means I'm stuck forever, because I can't go back and change the trauma. Right? And the next question I asked myself was, well, has everybody who's ever experienced trauma allowed it to destroy them? And the answer to that question was no. So therefore, it couldn't have been my trauma that defined me. So what was the defining thing that created this life that I didn't like so much? And it's what I chose to believe about myself, having lived through the trauma, is what I got to. And so forgiveness for me, just to be very clear, has nothing to do with the other person, right? I leave their actions and behaviors to them. It's not about letting the other person off the hook. It's about letting myself off the hook. Well, what am I letting myself off for the hook, and what am I taking responsibility for? And this is a really important piece, because people fail to take responsibility, because it's like, why would I take responsibility for something if I didn't know what to do with it? That would just cause me more trauma, right? Because now I'm just blaming myself. And the answer is that you take responsibility for the things you chose to believe. Now, my traumatic situation was when I was 5 years old and I was in kindergarten. My teacher called me up in front of the room and called me stupid and retarded every day, and made the whole class call me stupid and retarded when I was on my way out to special ed. My mom refused to intervene, told me the world was a cruel place. I was just going to have to get used to it. And it happened every day. And so what created my life? It wasn't the abuse. It was the fact that I chose to believe that I was stupid, that I was not good enough, that I was never going to be good enough. And those are the thoughts and ideas that created my life, that people were cruel. And, when I tell that story, Tim, it's really interesting. I'll have people go, oh, don't do that to yourself. Don't blame yourself. I'm like, what? You were only 5 years old. And I'm like, please stop trying to take away my power, right? Because yes, I was only 5 years old, and I will give the fact that I made the best decision I could with the information available, but it was my decision to make. And that is where we have our power, because I can't go back and change the abuse, but I can go back and change what that abuse meant to me. right? And the emotions attached to it. And that's where we have our power, is that we have the choice in what it is we choose to believe about ourselves, about the world. And the reason we talk about perception is because the underlying, principle around perception is what you believe and feel on the inside, is what creates, what you experience on the outside. And people don't really get that, even if they get that, because everything that's happening outside of them feels real. And the mind works so quickly, they think that they see reality when it couldn't be further from the truth. And so that's where people get caught up. And then the second piece where they get caught up is our book and our movie are all about perception and emotions, right? It's like, why perception and emotions? Because perception dictates everything that you are, everything that you experience. Emotions give your life the only meaning they have. And so it's like, well, if those are the two things that dictate our lives, then why don't we fully understand them, right? Why aren't we become experts in them? It's like the rule books to life. And that's why we started what we're doing, is because there are insights to the principles that dictate your experience, and those insights aren't secrets. So in our book, you read it, it's written on a 5th grade level because that's where my education stopped, right? But the other reason it's written on that level is because I didn't want anybody to get lost in the words, right? I wanted it to be in a language so simple that anybody could understand it, right? And that's really it. Those are the fundamentals. And emotions are really interesting because we've been touching on them all day. But here's the problem with our relationship with emotions is people are constantly making their emotions about other people, right? And other people's emotions about them. In other words, it's like, you made me mad, right? Well, nobody can make you anything. And it's like, oh, they're mad at me, it must mean something about me. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with you, right? And so the idea is that, and this is the thing I like to hit home with people, is your emotions aren't there to tell you there's something wrong on the outside. They're there to tell you that there's something wrong on the inside. Well, what are they there to tell you? And so it's interesting because, I was on a radio show the other night and I was talking about these concepts, and I was talking about, you can only see what you believe to be possible. And this lady comes on, she goes, that's not actually true, because I think that I'm great and no men are interested in me. And I said, well, that means you don't think that you're great. And I said, I don't want to put it any more blunt than that. She goes, well, how can you say that? I know what I think. And I said, you know what you think you know. But here's the deal, is that 95% of your mental cognition is in your subconscious and unconscious mind. So everything that your perception is sourcing is from that space. 5% that happens to be in your conscious mind is, in fact, probably believes what you think you believe. And it's like, people ask me all the time, well, how do I know what I believe? And I'm like, well, look at your life, right? It's a direct reflection. I can sit down with somebody and we can have a discussion about their current money situation. I can tell you what they believe about money, relationships, health, fitness, right? There is no mystery to life. And that's where people really get caught up. It's like, they think that life's mystery. I'm just shocked when people are like appalled or shocked about their results. And it's like, well, you drank, smoked, and ate terribly for 30 years. And now you're surprised. You think God's punishing because you have a heart attack? It's like, open your eyes and look at, what's going on. And so, that's where it comes down to with emotions, is that your emotions are literally pointing out one thing for you. When you have a negative emotional response, it means there is a contradiction between what's happening in your conscious mind and your subconscious and unconscious mind. And that's the key, is figuring out what that contradiction is trying to tell you. It means that you have a belief in your subconscious or unconscious mind that isn't congruent with what you think you want or what you think you are in your conscious mind. And it gives you an opportunity to go back and look. It's valuable information. But because we spend so much time either repressing or projecting our emotions onto others, we lose our only feedback mechanism, right? Not our only one, but it's our main one. And so it's like, these are the fundamental principles that dictate our lives. And people are just so lost and confused, like, it's a mystery. Life's a mystery. No, it's actually not a mystery once you understand the fundamentals.
And yet we live in a culture that teaches us the opposite of that. So that's why I'm so grateful to run across a book like yours that speaks to people at a very direct way about complex issues. I want to go back to something you said, because I know you've been at this long enough to know you might get a little pushback from time to time when you tell people that they created their experience. And the thing I really like about what you and Steph have done with the book is made it clear that what I created is my experience and the meaning I took from those events. I didn't necessarily create the person who was ridiculing me. And yet, when I'm willing to step into taking full responsibility for what I made it mean for me, that's what I'm carrying with me all those years. That's what's rippling out energetically in my words and behaviors and affecting my life. It's a very complex thought process, and it's very simple to apply the solution. And, your book and so many of the others that we work with say, listen, if I'm in mental, emotional pain, what that means is that's the wake-up call for me. Tim, your thoughts are off the mark. So there's two wonderful questions I ask people to step into. Whenever they notice they don't like what they're feeling, take a breath, get centered, and ask themselves, how am I creating this emotion? That's one good one. And the other one is, what am I making this situation mean? And then if you add that to your emotional integration technique?
Yes.
You add that to that and actually practice it. There's a powerful set of tools that you've made available for people in this book, the title of which is Perception, Seeing is Not Believing. And you've also got a rather magnificent website up at Powerful You. It's powerfulu.com. Is that correct?
Powerful-u.com. Yes.
Correct. Well, I realize we're getting low on time here. Let me ask, what is it that we might not have gotten to yet that you want to make sure we give our listeners a look at before we wrap up today?
So, and I touched on this, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper into it. And it's this. There may be people that are listening to the sounds of our voices and they're considering taking their lives. They're depressed. They feel like they don't have any hope. And what I would say to those people is there is always hope. And, there's a narrative in the book, and the narrative in the book is that you've never made a bad decision, right? And, I tell people that and they go, no, James, I've made a lot of bad decisions. And they're like, how can you even say that? You were in jail. And I would say, because you're not even capable of making a bad decision unless you're mentally ill. And that confuses people. And they say, well, okay, what's the punchline? And the punchline is you've only ever made a decision with bad information. And they're like, well, that's phonetics. I'm like, no. And there's a very important distinction that you need to understand. And here's the distinction. Is the reason you've never made a bad decision is because we all make decisions the same way. We look at the available information and we make the best decision we can with that information. A bad decision would be, I'm going to make a decision right now I know is, against my beliefs and in my best interest, right? But that's not the way we do it, right? And that's where the confusion sets in. Look, it's no secret, good information leads to good decisions, leads to good outcome. Faulty information leads to faulty decisions, leads to faulty outcomes. And so the reason that's so important is you can stop beating yourself up. This really isn't a you problem. There's nothing wrong with you, right? It's an information problem, plain and simple, right? Your mind is full of information that's holding you back. And so that's why it's so important is you can stop beating yourself up, right? If you think that my life is better than yours, or I have things that you want that you currently don't have, it's not because I'm smarter. It's not because, any other reason than the fact that I had better information by which to make my decisions. And so what is the source of our information? And that's where perception and emotions come in. They are our source and our way of interacting with the world. And so we have to understand the source of information, the mechanism by which we receive that information, so we can go back to the source, which is our beliefs and understandings. And so I think it was, an author said, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, right? And such a beautiful thing is because people don't understand that. We're all caught in this world where we think that we're running around trying to fix things, right? It's like trying to fix this. And it's like, well, why are you trying to fix things on the outside? Because what's on the outside is only a reflection of what's in the inside. So it's literally like trying to change things at the level of effect. And so it's like going to a movie and slapping the screen and expecting to change what's on the projector, right? And so if you want to change what you're experiencing on the outside, you have to change what you believe on the inside. So if you're running around trying to fix things on the outside or blame things and do things like that, then you're wasting your time, right? Because, essentially life is like a video game. And when you think about a video game, you're inserting yourself into a world and you're playing against a program. Well, the program, basically what's happening with perception is that your beliefs are being projected on the screen of the world. And that's what you're interacting with. And so once you understand that principle, it's like, well, where do I start? And here's where you start. It's always with a question. And it's like, start with this. Understand that you're wrong. And people go, what am I wrong about? Well, it turns out just about everything. And that's the best news. Because life was never, ever about finding answers. Life is about asking the right questions. When you ask the right questions, answers come. But you can never start a question off with knowing. A question dictates that you don't know. If you know everything and you refuse to challenge your current set of beliefs, then your life right now is the best it's ever going to be. And so you have to learn how to question everything. All of your thoughts, all of your feelings, all of your perceptions. Where is this going on? How am I feeling? And when you get into the mode of questioning, right, then your life starts to shift and change rapidly. All of this information I'm talking about came from a single question, and then another one, and then another one. I didn't read books on perception or psychology to come up with these ideas or concepts. And, thankfully at the beginning of this conversation, you said, everything that's written in this book is based on sound principles, right? And you know that because you studied those principles. I didn't study those principles. I asked a lot of questions of myself and my experience. And that's why I think that the book and the movie is so valuable, because it'll open you up to a new set of information, a new idea. You can't, it's like walking into a room and flipping on a light switch. You can't go back into the dark, right?
Well, and I have to say that there's so much good stuff in it that I want people to know, if they get the book Perception, seeing is not believing. And the first read is just the beginning. So I recommend reading it multiple times within the first year you get it, and you'll see something different every time. And to whatever degree you can, if you can start applying some of the exercises, you can transform your life.
Well, awareness is the first step, right? And that's the thing that people don't understand. It's like, once you become aware of it, right, that's the first step, because it's like people are living in the dark. And so when you read it through the first time, you're like, wait, there's a lot more going on here than I thought.
Exactly.
Right? And then it's like, I can't unknow that. And so start with the awareness and then move into the exercise. Start becoming aware of everything that's going on around you, your perception, your emotions, how it tying that physiology of fear with the perception of fear. And just look at your current life and the results, and it'll open your eyes.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I look forward to the time I can interview you again and find out what you've been up to. Thank you so much for all you do. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it.
I look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.